Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuhu, everybody. My name is Nader Sufi. On behalf of Eid United, we welcome you all to today's program on Islamic laws of inheritance. We have an amazing program set out for you. Right before we get into that, just a little bit about us here at Eid United. So we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to uniting Muslims in Southern California, along with our virtual presence. We're committed to providing uplifting and intellectual programs using an online platform to meet the needs of our diverse Muslim community. During these very interesting times, we're on the forefront during the COVID-19 pandemic by providing personal protective equipment to healthcare workers to help them with this whole situation we're going through. Also, during Ramadan, we here at Eid United have been providing daily iftar meals for families and individuals of need. This past Eid was a bit different, where we made sure to keep these traditions and festivities of Eid by providing treats and nice goodie bags to our beloved community. Today, Eid United continues the tradition by bringing the community together by addressing topics that are vital to our communities. At this point, we have an extraordinary panel of speakers today that will be addressing questions and concerns of laws of inheritance in Islam. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our beloved moderator for today's program, Sister Saima Hamid, and she will go ahead and take it from here. Over to you, Sister Saima.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters. I want to welcome you to today's program on the extremely important topic of Islamic inheritance. Before we begin, I just want to say that on behalf of Eid United, we are sending our du'as and prayers for anyone and everyone who is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that there are many beloved members in our own communities who are dealing with this. And we are praying for their health and recovery, and for all those who are affected. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them shifa and a speedy recovery. These are very unprecedented times that we are living through, and we at Eid United are committed to bringing us together as a community, even though we are physically separated at this time. We want to let you know that we are here for you, and we are hopeful that inshallah there will be an end to this pandemic and we will be able to come together again in person as a community. But in the meantime, we are here today to address a very important topic. It is a topic that affects each and every one of us. It's the Islamic laws of inheritance. And although it is a very important part of the Sharia law, and it has its sources in the Quran, many of us are confused and don't have knowledge about this topic, and especially how it interacts with the laws of inheritance and estate planning in California and how we manage to deal with both. And so what we're hoping today to do with this program is to shed some light on this topic, to provide clarity, basic understanding of Islamic principles of inheritance, and also how to manage this, dealing with Islamic inheritance principles while also complying with the laws of our state. And so today we have a very distinguished panel of speakers. We had hoped that Dr. Yahya Abdul Rahman would be able to join us, but unfortunately he is not able to join us today. However, we have a very, very distinguished, esteemed panel of speakers who will provide will provide very enlightening information on this topic. And with that, we'll begin with our first speaker, who really needs no introduction. He is one of our most beloved, respected elders and leaders and religious leaders and scholars in our local community, as well as the nation and around the world, Dr. Muzammil Siddiqui. Let me give you a brief bio, though. After completing his studies at Darul Uloom Nadwatul Ulama in Lucknow, India, Dr. Siddiqui received his bachelor's degree in Islamic and Arabic studies from the Islamic University of Medina, Saudi Arabia, and later went on to complete his PhD in comparative religion at Harvard University. Since 1981, he has served as the director of the Islamic Society of Orange County in Garden Grove, California. He is the chairman of the Fiqh Council of North America. Internationally, he is a member of the executive board of the International Assembly of the Council of Ulama in Mecca, a member of the Supreme Islamic Council of Egypt, and the Supreme Council of Mosques in Mecca. Dr. Siddiqui served as president of the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, from 1996 to 2000. Without further ado, please let me welcome Dr. Muzammil Siddiqui.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Sister Saima, and all the people who are in the audience. May Allah bless you all, protect you, protect your families. Those who are in difficulties, we pray for them. Those who passed away, pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them maghfirah and give patience to their families. Certainly we ask Allah to remove this pain, this suffering from us and from the whole world. The topic is Islamic laws of inheritance. In Islam, as we have laws for ibadah, how to perform our prayers, fasting, charity, hajj, as we have laws for marriage, divorce, also we have laws for inheritance. The laws of inheritance are called ahkam al-mawaris, or also there is another very interesting word that is used is al-faraid. Faraid are those that are obligations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the gift of wealth to people, and whosoever has money, whether it's a small amount or big amount, during their life they can use it as they want, of course in the halal ways, but after the death it is important that this money should be distributed according to the laws of inheritance. In states, in the societies where laws, Islamic laws are practiced and recognized, of course that is understood that the wealth will be distributed according to that. But here in America, these laws are not recognized, so it is important for us that we should prepare our will, and we should have directions clearly given to our heirs and to other people, anyone, that is that our assets will be distributed according to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These laws are very important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has used very strong words in the Quran in explaining these laws, as mentioned in Surah An-Nisa. Allah says, Yusikumullah. Allah instructs you, Allah charges you that you do that. And they also called Faridatan min Allah. It is an obligation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is wasiyya min Allah. Tilka hududullah. These are the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And those who obey the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will give them Jannah. As Allah says in the Quran, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ وَمَنْ يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ يُدْخِلُهُ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي مِنْ تَحْتِهَا الْأَنْهَارُ خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا وَذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. These are the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those who obey Allah and His Messenger, Allah will give them entry into Jannat, into the gardens beneath which rivers flow, where they shall abide forever, and that is a great success. And then Allah says, وَمَنْ يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيَتَعَدَّ حُدُودَهُ يُدْخِلُ نَارًا خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَلَهُ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. And those who disobey Allah and His Messenger and transgress the limits, Allah will give them hell, and they will be there in that, and for them is a disgraceful punishment. May Allah save us from that. So there is a hadith also mentioned. Many authorities quote this hadith, emphasizing the point. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu says that a person may live, a man or woman may live 60 years, 70 years in obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they do injustice in their will. They don't give the right instructions for that their wealth be distributed among their heirs in the just manner according to the rules of Allah, and then they bring upon themselves the hellfire. May Allah save us from that. So it is important that people should look at these rules and take serious attention to them. In your life, of course, it's your money. You can use it the way you want it, in the right way, of course, in the halal way. But after the death, the laws of inheritance should be followed. And being here in this society where these laws are not recognized, then we should have our wills prepared. We should consult scholars. We should consult lawyers, local lawyers who know the laws of the state where you are, and then they prepare that. There's details of the laws. I'm not going to go into the details, but just some principles I want to mention. The first thing is that after the death of a person, his burial, funeral expenses, medical bills, any debts, they all have to be paid from his assets. So first thing is from his assets, these expenses taken care of. If somebody else wants to pay for the funeral, that's okay. They can do that. Children want to do that. Other family members want to do that. They can do that. But if it can be taken out. These expenses can be taken out from his assets. And the second thing is, of course, the debts should be paid. Whatever debt you have to they should be given. And then after that, there is something called wasiyah. Wasiyah is the bequest. A person is allowed to give to whomsoever he wills, whomsoever he wants, to individuals, family members, anyone else, institution, organization. One can give up to 1/3. It is not that it's your money and you can give 100% to a masjid or to a hospital or to a school or something. It is important that you have to leave something for your heirs. And Allah, the Prophet ﷺ said that this is only 1/3. Sulus wal sulusu kasir. That is only 1/3, within 1/3. I mean, you can be less than that, but not more than 1/3. And so this 1/3 can be given to any person, any institution, and but of course you cannot give it to those who are going to inherit, whose portions are mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because the Hadith says, "La wasiyata liwaris." There is no wasiyah, there is no bequest for someone who is already going to inherit. So they have their share already. You cannot increase the share by giving from this 1/3. The other principle is important, that only Muslims are allowed to inherit from a Muslim. Non-Muslim relatives do not inherit from Muslims, and Muslims do not inherit from non-Muslims. So if somebody has a spouse who is not a Muslim, then she will not automatically inherit from the assets of that person. He can write from this wasiyah. He can make a special bequest for her and say that she can get so much from that. Of course, should not be more than what her share would have been if she was inheriting according to the rules. So it is within that limit, but it can be given. So and in a similar way, if a non-Muslim leaves some money and give it, somebody has a non-Muslim parent or some other members, and they give something, one can receive that as a gift, but not as a right of inheritance. Adopted children they are not children, they are not your children, so they should not get any right in this inheritance. Again, one can write for them anything. If somebody has any adopted children, one can write from within the 1/3 that is given. Illegitimate children, May God save us from that. If somebody has illegitimate children, again, they will not inherit according to most of the authorities. Some say that mother's wealth, mother's assets, they can get their share from that, but not from the father's assets, because that's illegitimate relationship. So in that case, and some say that there is no sin of the child, so they said that even they can be part of the inheritance. But of course, it is haram. One should not have that kind of thing. The law says that a murderer or a person who is accessory in the murder of a person cannot inherit from that person. So that person is excluded from any inheritance. Among the surviving relatives, there are three categories. They are called Zawil Furud, Al-Asabat, and Zawil Arham. Zawil Furud are those whose shares are specified and mentioned in the Quran and in the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So they are designated shares they have. After that, there are others who are subsidiaries, Asabat. For them, there are some shares, and that's also mentioned, and one should follow that. And then the third category, in case the furud are not there and asabat are not there, then comes the Zawil Arham. So they are the spouse and children and parents. They always receive if they survive. If they survive the person, then they will always have their share. And then, so there is the right of in the inheritance. There is the right of children, there is the right of parents, and also there's the right of the spouse. And these are designated and specified in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. If any of them predecease, then other relatives take their place, and they will get their share in that. So those who are closer, those who are nearer, that means they exclude those who are distant. In case of the death of those who are near relatives, then the second category will come and they will take over on that. So this is the way how it is developed, and all share must be according to the specified percentage that is given in the Sharia according to the Quran. So as you mentioned that Muslims in America should prepare their will according to the Islamic law of it. And we are thankful, we are grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that it is possible for Muslims to prepare their will and register it, and in that case their wealth will be distributed according to Islamic law. If people die without having their will prepared, then they call it intestate. In this situation, the state will take over. There will be probate courts that will come, and they will assign someone. So it is it is possible for you to avoid certain taxes if you prepare your will beforehand in your life. Otherwise, there will be a lot of taxes. Sometimes there will be 70 or 80% of your money will go there in those taxes. Interstate cases go to the probate courts, and probate courts often take long time to make decision, and the heirs may wait and undergo hardship. The court-appointed executor may not apply Islamic laws, Islamic rules, and it also to inventory all the person's assets and prepare the details, all of these things. It involves also much unnecessary expenses, so you can avoid that also. And also if the deceased leaves minor children, that the court-appointed executor may give them to a stranger, total stranger, or a person of another faith as a guardian to Muslim children. So it is important to understand that your wealth is an amana, is a trust, and you should use it in the right way. And another thing is, if there are no other relatives, if somebody did not prepare a will and there are no relatives, then the money will go to any charity. They may go to any institution, so maybe non-Islamic institution, maybe institutions that are working against Islam. So it is important that your money should go into the right place and you should prepare that. So these are just some important principles that I mentioned. We can take some questions and answer those. Barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Siddiqui, for illuminating for us the basic principles of Islamic inheritance. I think that was very helpful for all of us. And now we will turn to Sheikh Mustafa Umar, who will further illuminate on this topic. And I would also like to say that at the end of our panel discussion, we will have time for questions and answers. So please do send in questions. You can text them at the number at the bottom of the screen or email them. And inshallah, we will do our best to field as many of those questions to the panel as possible. With that, I would like to introduce Sheikh Mustafa Umar. Born and raised in Orange County, Sheikh Mustafa Umar completed his bachelor's in Information and Computer Science from UC Irvine, a bachelor's in Theology and Islamic Law from the European Institute of Islamic Sciences in France, and a master's degree in Islamic Studies from the University of Gloucester in England. I think I mispronounced that. He also studied the Islamic sciences for a year at Darul Uloom Nadwatul Ulama in Lucknow, India, and spent another year studying in Cairo, Egypt. He has authored several books, served the Muslim community of Southern California as an imam and activist for over a decade, and is currently the founder and president of California Islamic University, the director of education and outreach at the Islamic Institute of Orange County, and an executive member of the Fiqh Council of North America. Welcome to the panel, Sheikh Mustafa.
Alhamdulillah, thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah, wa ba'd. So Alhamdulillah, Dr. Muzammil has given a great overview of the rules of inheritance. And I just want to reflect on some of the spiritual and intellectual aspects of the system of inheritance in Islam. There's a hadith narrated by Imam Bukhari where the Messenger of Allah ﷺ came, somebody asked him a question, and they said, Messenger of Allah, which charity has the greatest reward? Like, what is the best type of charity that we can give? And he said that you give charity while you're healthy, but you're still in need, and you're in a state of poverty, and you're still trying to acquire wealth. I mean, you don't have that much money, but you're still giving money in charity. And then he said, وَلَا تُمْهِلُوا حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغَتِ الْحُلْقُومِ. And he says, don't give off, like don't delay giving charity until you get very close to death. Like you're about to die. And then you start thinking about charity. And then you say, قُلْتَ لِفُلَانٍ كَذَا وَلِفُلَانٍ كَذَا. Then you start saying, you know what, I want this much to go to this person. I want this much to go to this organization. I want to donate to this other organization. And then he said, وَقَدْ كَانَ لِفُلَانٍ. He said, when it already belongs to that person. What he means is that he's talking about charity. And in the context of charity, he says, once you start getting near death and you start thinking, oh, where do I want to leave all my money? And you start thinking about the 1/3 wasiyah that you can give, the bequest that you can give from your money. You start thinking, I'm going to give some to here, some to here. The Prophet ﷺ said, it already belongs to someone else. Meaning that the concept in Islam is that when a person dies, none of the money that they made, their entire life, they worked hard their entire life. They thought about all the investments. They were thinking about the stock market. It's a bull market or a bear market. You know, they were investing in the right, whatever investments out there. But none of that money, they can't take it to the grave. All of that money belongs to somebody else. The moment you die, that money is no longer yours. And that's the concept in Islam, that when you die, you don't own anything. And that money is automatically going to be distributed to your heirs. And you get a choice if you decided early enough to give up to 1/3 maximum to whoever you want. The rest of it is decided by Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us certain rules which have specific rules of distribution in Islam. And what's interesting is when we look at it, several verses in the Quran which explain this. And when we look at these verses, it reveals a lot about the concept and the philosophy of what Islam is teaching. First of all, Allah says, لِلْرِجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ. He says that for men, they will have a portion or a share from what the parents or the relatives leave. And then he says, وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ. He says, and then for women, they will also have a share for what those relatives leave. So it's very interesting. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have just said, Muslims have a share. When you die, your relatives will have a share. But he specifically said, men will have a share and women will have a share. Why is that so interesting? It's because if we look at it from a historical perspective, most religions, most civilizations, they excluded women from inheritance completely. There was no inheritance for women at all. In fact, recently I was reading a biography of Sheikh Akram Nadwi, who also went to Nadwa like myself and Dr. Muzammil did. Very well-known scholar. He was saying that in the village that he lives in, he's saying until today, these are Muslims who live in the village in India where he's from, he says women are still excluded from inheritance. They don't get any inheritance for some reason, even though it's very strange. He says, they sent me to the Islamic University, Nadwa. I come back and I tell them, hey, according to the Quran, rules of Islam, women are supposed to, get some inheritance. They say, did we send you to the madrasa to go learn this stuff, to preach back to us, So some people still have that concept. It's a historical concept that women have been excluded from inheritance in many religions and many systems. And still till today, many civilizations, many countries, and even some Muslims in their ignorance, they still exclude women. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that men will get this and women will get this, separated it out with a conjunction in between to make it very, very clear that we are overhauling the system. This system that has existed in the past is not going to fly anymore. So that's one interesting thing. And the second thing he says, مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرٍ. Says it doesn't matter if it's a little bit or if it's a lot. So sometimes people have this conception that, inheritance really is only for people who have a lot of money. If you have a little bit of money, it's not a big deal. No, it's a big deal. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا. It's all in Surah An-Nisa, verse 7. It says, نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا, meaning a fixed share. And the word mafruḍa, it means like it's an obligation from the word fard. And that's why when Dr. Muzammil, he said that the word is called mirath or it's called fara'id. Fara'id from the word fard. Fard is like mandatory. It's a requirement, something you absolutely have to do. All of the 5 prayers that you do, you pray your fard prayers, right? So this is something very serious. We don't take it lightly. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put these, verses in the Quran, and when we analyze the verses and we just look at the tafsir of the explanation, the commentary of why these verses exist in a certain way, even when it comes to inheritance, we learn a lot about, how this changes society in our perception of what is wealth and how wealth should be distributed within a community. And then another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, a few verses later, he says, آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا. He says, your parents and your children, you don't know which one of them is closer to you in bringing you benefit. Like, you don't know which one exactly is going to bring you the most benefit. This is very interesting. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that, you have parents and you have children and you have different relatives. And the reality is, sometimes we like some of our relatives more than others, right? Sometimes you have 2 children and you're like, let's say you have 2 sons or 2 daughters. Say, yeah, but this one was always, whenever I asked for a cup of chai, they always got it for me. This other one, every time I asked for anything, they wouldn't do it. This one always does their homework. This one, very hard. I have to put in extra time to make them do their homework. So it opens up the door for people to be like, because you didn't, take care of me and because you didn't do what I wanted or whatever it is, I'm not going to give you the same inheritance. I'm going to exclude you. I'm going to make a different thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying no. Saying you don't know who's closer to you. You don't know, it doesn't matter who your favorite is. What matters is there's a system. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows which relative to give priority to. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that everyone has to be treated equitably and along the same line if they're in the same category. Two sons, two daughters, two brothers, two parents, they have to be treated, they have to be given their share according to the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed it. Why? It says, فَرِيضَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. This is an obligation from Allah. This is a commandment from Allah. Indeed, Allah is knowing and wise. Meaning that Allah knows what is the best distribution. Allah knows what is the best way to take care of family and how to distribute wealth. That's going to be the best for the entire world. Otherwise, all sorts of philosophers can sit there and they can think about, well, we think that, this is how it should be split. In the past, women used to be excluded completely, right? Wives got nothing when the husband died. Now, wives, as a default, generally get everything. So your parents are excluded, your children are excluded. So there's always some type of injustice taking place. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, no, this is not the way, this is not the best family system. This is not good for the family system. So instead, Allah has given us certain shares and He's made it specified in a way, and we can see that wisdom. And one of the other wisdoms is a test from Allah. It's a test from Allah for each and every single Muslim, that when you die, are you going to leave the money, your money that you earned, are you going to leave it in the way that Allah wants you to? Or are you going to be like, no, I don't care. I'm going to leave it to whoever I want. So I have 5 kids. 2 of them were very good, always nice to me. And the other 3, no, I'm going to exclude them. They get nothing. And if you don't marry that girl that I want you to marry from that village back home, you're excluded from the inheritance. You're written out of the will. This is not something that's allowed for Muslims. And that's a test from Allah. Are you going to do what Allah wants you to do? And knowing the fact that Allah is the knowing and the wise, you can't do that. So this is a test from Allah, in addition to having a greater wisdom of supporting the entire family and giving shares of money to the people, to each person who's closer to you in some type of blood relationship. So this is actually very healthy for society. And in a society in which we live in, where there's a breakdown of the family system, everyone acts like they're unique individuals, as if like family doesn't matter, parents don't matter, children don't matter, spouse doesn't matter, brothers and sisters, none of that matter. It's all about me and whoever I think. Everyone's an individual. But that's not the way Islam looks at it. Everyone's an individual and stand in front of Allah to account. But there are responsibilities. The way there's responsibility to your neighbor, there's a responsibility to your family. And this actually helps society flourish. And when the family breaks down, we find that society breaks down as well. So these are some of the wisdoms behind it. And also, when you look at the rules, sometimes you're going to see the shares are like 1/4, 1/8, 1/3, 2/3. And you're like, if there's no children and then you have a brother, what if you have a sister, 2 sisters and a half sister, or a brother from your mother's side, brother from your father's side? It can get very complex sometimes. And sometimes we think, well, what's the benefit of this complexity? Why make it so tricky and all that? Well, first of all, finances are always tricky. This is the reality of it. People value money very much, and people put, a lot of emphasis on it. And when it comes to accounting and everything, they're very, even investment strategies, and today all sorts of people coming up with derivatives and, different type of investment strategies to make more money. So it's an economic issue, and economic issues are complex. So we should understand that. But the second thing is that the Islamic law of inheritance played a major role in history, and I don't think many Muslims don't understand this. I mean, the Islamic laws of inheritance, they actually served as an impetus behind developing the science of algebra. So those of you who most of you probably studied algebra. Algebra comes from the word al-jabr, right? Al-jabr. It's an Arabic word, al-jabr, and it was primarily formed by a Muslim mathematician by the name of Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi and other, medieval Islamic mathematicians. And al-Khwarizmi wrote a book called Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. Very famous book. It's pretty much the book which, solidified the science of algebra. It was a foundational textbook for algebra in the first place. And some Muslims are starting to know about this now. And they're like, mashallah, yeah, we heard of Khwarizmi and we know algebra came from Islam and all that. But what they don't know is that in his book, which is the foundational text for algebra, 1/3 of the entire book, the longest chapter in the book, was dedicated to solving problems related to Islamic inheritance using algebra. So basically, the science of algebra actually developed out of solving Islamic inheritance equations or Islamic inheritance issues. And then later on, there was another mathematician by the name of Al-Hassar. He was from the Maghrib, Maghrib meaning Northern Africa. And he specialized in fiqh. He was a specialist in Islamic jurisprudence during the 12th century. And he's the one who developed this modern symbolic mathematical notation for fractions, where you put the numerator and then you put a line, you put a horizontal bar, and then you put the denominator on the bottom. So when you write 2 over 3, that line in the middle was invented by this guy. And what was he? He was not just a mathematician, he was a specialist in fiqh, and he used to work on Islamic inheritance issues. So this was a way that he developed. He said it's so much easier to solve these inheritance problems when we draw this little line. Every single time you draw a line, you write 1/4 and you put that little bar over there in between the 1 and the 4. That's Hassar. Why? Because of Islamic inheritance. And I'll give you just one last example because time is limited. In the 15th century, there was another scholar by the name of Abu al-Hasan ibn Ali al-Qasadi. And he was a specialist in fiqh as well. He's a faqih. He's an expert in Islamic jurisprudence. And he came up with this idea of using mathematical notation for algebra, which basically introduced algebraic symbolism. So he used mathematical symbols. He used Arabic characters instead. So like the X, Y, and Z, when we use X, Y, and Z in algebra, he was using those Arabic letters. And what's really interesting is he was doing this exactly around the same time when the Muslims were being kicked out of Spain, the last city in Spain, Granada, to fall. And the Muslims were completely wiped out of Spain. At the fall of Granada by Ferdinand and Isabella, when they came and they invaded and the Muslims' presence from Spain was completely eliminated, that's when this guy was coming up with this. So can you think about that? Like, today we're in a pandemic and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help all those people who are going through difficulty. But despite the difficulty, Muslims had lost all the cities in Spain. They've been persecuted. There's inquisition taking place. They're being forcefully converted into Christianity. And the last city is about to fall, Granada, and we have Abu al-Hasan is sitting there and he's working out his equations and he comes up with X, Y, and Z, which is revolutionary in mathematics when you do higher level mathematics. What would math be like if we didn't have those variables? And he's accomplishing these new technology, new inventions, despite the very difficult circumstances that they were living in. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to understand our history, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us understand the wisdom and the philosophy behind Islamic inheritance. Ameen. Jazakumullah khairan.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh Mustafa, for explaining the spiritual, philosophical, and historical context underlying the Islamic principles of inheritance. I think that helps us all have a better understanding of why the rules are specified the way they are. And so with that, now we can turn to our next speaker, who is well known to many of us in the community, having grown up in our local community here. Attorney Masood Khan has been an attorney for over 16 years, practicing in the areas of business law, estate planning, and nonprofits. He received his bachelor's from UCLA and his JD from the UC Davis School of Law. In addition to the practice of law, Masood is also a faculty lecturer at Cal State University, Los Angeles, where he teaches courses in business law. He has served on the board of several nonprofit organizations and currently serves as the board member of Zaytuna College. He resides in Upland, California with his family, and his law firm, Khan Law Group LC, is based in Rancho Cucamonga. With that, I will turn it over to Attorney Masood Khan.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui. Thank you, Saima. Thank you, Sheikh Mustafa, for your presentations. It makes it a lot easier for me, and it creates a very good underlying understanding for everybody else when I talk a little bit about the actual legal aspects of it and how the nuts and bolts of it play out in our legal system in California and in other states. So I wanted to just start with letting people understand how the actual inheritance happens structurally in the state of California under our legal system. So I'm going to actually have a few slides I'm going to start with, so I think that'll help everybody kind of get some of these points down. So I'm going to move to the next, if you can please to move to the next slide. So some basic terminology that we wanted to be familiar with for today. These are some common legal words that you'll come across if you're doing research on your own about how inheritance works and what how you need to distribute the assets. And of course, if you're doing it Islamically, then it becomes even more important because you need to know how and when you can distribute these things Islamically. So let's start with some basic terms here. So what is an estate? So this is probably a term that you've come across, and sometimes it's used interchangeably with inheritance or asset distribution. People call it estate planning. So basically the word estate, it's a very simple word. It just refers to everything that a person owns. Okay, so that would be your real estate, your home, jewelry, everything else. Literally everything that you own is known as your estate. Okay, so the idea here is that you want to plan for what you want to do with that estate. And as Sheikh Mustafa already mentioned, the idea here is that once a person passes away, there is a set of rules that applies, and those assets no longer are owned by you, and you have to make sure that they're going to go to the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned in the Quran, whose right it is to get those assets. So if we can move to the next slide. So estate planning is the process of planning for the distribution and the management of those assets that you own while you're alive, right? So you don't want to wait until a person has passed away, because then you have very little control. Spiritually you have no control, physically you have no control over it, and so you want to make sure that all of these assets are going to go to the right people. And of course, as Muslims, we want to make sure that those assets are going to go to the people who are supposed to inherit them under the Sharia. So that's what we want to focus on, is estate planning. If we can move to the next slide. So one of the things that happens if somebody does not have an estate plan, and an estate plan can be very basic. The simplest estate plan would be literally just to write a will that says who is supposed to get what when a person dies. So in California, literally the simplest way this can happen is by writing what's called a holographic will. That is a handwritten letter signed in signed at the bottom by yourself, that says who is supposed to get what. That would be the simplest form of estate planning, and that is recognized under the state of California as a valid form of a will. Okay, so of course you don't want to rely just on a holographic will. You want to have something a little bit more planned out and a little bit more elaborate, particularly for many people. They own real estate, they own stocks, they own a bunch of more sophisticated instruments that you want to make sure are addressed properly. So what happens if somebody doesn't have a will or doesn't have any kind of estate plan, and specifically doesn't have a will? So if they don't have a will, then they, as Dr. Siddiqui mentioned, they will die what's called intestate. That's a legal term. So if a person who dies intestate, that means that they have no will, no nothing that says where their assets are supposed to go. If you do have a will, even a holographic will or even a typed up will that you've written out, it has to go through a process called probate. Okay, so there is a special court called the probate court, and the probate court's role is to if there's a will, it's to oversee the will, to prove the will, that this is in fact the will of this person, that they signed it. And in the will, a person will have maybe appointed what's called an executor, a person who's responsible to be in charge of the assets and to distribute them according to the instructions. And the court actually oversees that process. It can be a pretty elaborate process. It's a little Byzantine, and there's there's a lot of steps involved. It requires the beneficiaries to actually file the petition in the court. So nothing happens automatically. Actually, so the people who, let's say there's a family who has a house, or let's say a man who has a house, he dies, he has children. The children just don't automatically get the house. They actually have to file for a petition in probate court, and it goes through a number of steps before the assets are actually then distributed to the family members. And you actually need to typically hire a lawyer to do that. It is a pretty complex process. You have to hire a lawyer who's specialized in probate. And the way the fees are structured for a probate lawyer, it's actually structured in California law as a portion of the size of the estate. So typically that would be 4% for the first $100,000 of the estate, 3% for the next 100,000, and then 2% for the next 800,000, and so on. There's some additional numbers. But for, say, $1 million, let's say the estate is worth $1 million, you're talking over $20,000 that the lawyer is going to get out of that. It could be more than that. So that this probate process is pretty complicated. You want to avoid it as much as possible, right? So if you have a will, it will be probated. If you don't have a will, it will still be probated, okay, and then you die intestate. The problem with not having a will is that because there's no instructions, the deceased party has given no instructions on how to distribute the assets. The state of California has its own schedule of distribution. So when a person dies intestate, meaning without any instructions, without any estate plan, then the court will apply this intestate schedule, which is basically a preset schedule that says the wife will get a certain amount, the children will get a certain amount. And the family actually has no control over it. They may, in some circumstances, they can try to petition the court to say, oh no, we had this note from him and he said this and that, but it can be pretty difficult. So you want to avoid this process. And as I mentioned already, from an Islamic perspective, if a person dies intestate, then you're basically, the distribution is not going to follow the Islamic schedule, the Islamic distribution schedule. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So how does a person avoid probate? First of all, as I mentioned, if you have a will, that's still better than nothing, because you can still make sure that the assets are distributed to the family members in the way that you want. But if you can avoid it, it's always best to avoid probate. The best way to avoid probate is to set up something called a living trust, which is basically a legal instrument that allows a person to transfer ownership of their assets to this trust. And so when a person does that, they transfer all of their assets to the trust. On paper, they don't really own anything, right? So on paper, they don't own anything. And as a result, when they die, they don't have to go through a probate court to have those assets distributed. It is now up to the trustees of the trust to make sure that those assets are distributed. And in the trust, you would provide instructions on who gets which assets. And in that point, you can include all of the Islamic instructions in terms of, making sure they comply with the Quranic requirements. So that is basically the most effective way to avoid having your assets done away with in a way that does not, that avoids, any probate, avoids the probate costs, and also is a quicker process because there's no court involved. The trustee can immediately distribute the assets to the beneficiaries, and it also, just in the end, it creates it's a private process, so you don't have to, go through a court. And one of the aspects of a court is that, it is public record, so a lot of the stuff that is filed in court is open for anybody to review and to look at. So can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so the question that always comes up is, okay, so I have these Islamic beliefs about and requirements, and how does that comport with California law or U.S. law? Can I actually do that? Can I actually make sure my assets are distributed Islamically? Does it violate California law? And the answer is no. The Islamic distribution does not violate California law or any other law for that matter. Generally, California law and pretty much the laws of every other state in the United States allows for individuals to decide how to distribute their assets. It is a pretty strongly enforced and upheld principle that people, because it's their assets, because they own these assets, they earn them, they work for them, they're free to distribute as they see fit. And to give you an example of how much this principle is enforced, a person can actually give away their assets to a pet and under California law, and not give their assets to an actual living family member. And they can cut out family members and whatnot. So the courts don't question, your right to distribute and how you want to distribute. So certainly, if you have an Islamic schedule in terms of how you want to distribute the assets, those will absolutely be upheld. You're free to include whatever shares that you want, and not only for the wasiyah, for the charitable part of it, but also for your family members. So we can move to the next slide, please. So there's a number of different types of trusts. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of it, but just generally, the trust, there's something called a living trust, which is also called a revocable trust. It allows people to transfer their assets into the trust and avoid probate if they have a certain number of assets or a certain type of assets that they want to go to either a charity, or maybe they have certain beneficiaries they want them to go to. They can set up other types of trusts called, there's different types of irrevocable trusts, which are basically trusts that once they're set up, they cannot be changed, or they have limitations on how they can be dealt with. There's, in terms of wasiyah, setting aside money for charity, there's different ways that can be done as well. And a lot of this depends on the size of a person's estate. The larger the estate, and if it crosses over a certain threshold, then there are certain tax implications. So obviously, you want to minimize those tax implications, and you want to maximize the amount of money that's going to the rightful beneficiaries. So there's a number of different instruments that can be used to do that. One of them, for example, is something called a charitable remainder trust. If you are setting aside money for charity, it allows you to donate money to a charity while still, generating revenue, get a tax write-off, but then the charity actually is allowed to take title to the property once the person dies. So, there's a lot of Sharia implications to this as well. I'm not a mufti, so, a lot of these questions that do come up for different situations, for different families, are often subject to going over with a scholar to kind of figure out how these things should be structured. Not all of the inheritance instruments or estate planning instruments are Sharia compliant. So that's another aspect to it. So if you really want to make sure that it's done Islamically, then it's important to involve the input from a qualified alim who can provide that information. Can we move to the next slide? So there's a couple of other things that I wanted to mention that are also related to having an estate plan, and they're also very important for a family and for the person to kind of think about before they die, because again, once the person dies, then they have very little control over what happens with certain things. So one of these things is called the durable power of attorney. This basically gives, it's a document that gives legal authority to a person in the event of incapacity. It gives legal authority to the other spouse to make certain legal or financial decisions for them, to access bank accounts, retirement accounts, or investment accounts. If it's in the name of one spouse, then it's not, that this allows the other spouse or another family member or another trusted individual that you've indicated in the power of attorney to act on your behalf. So this becomes very important. For example, if a person is in a coma, and there's assets that are needed to be liquidated, or a bank account that needs to be accessed, the durable power of attorney will allow the other spouse or that other person to do that. The other thing is something called the Advanced Healthcare Directive, which is basically provides guidance to the family of a person in the event that there is a terminal illness or a person is on life support, how they want that situation to be dealt with. And this is also something that I would encourage people to think about, and also consult with a scholar about as well, because there's different opinions, and I'm sure Dr. Siddiqui and Sheikh Mustafa can provide some input in the Q&A, but there's situations where people are on life support and maybe it's irreversible, they cannot come out of it. In that situation, is it permissible to withhold, continued life support? Is it permissible to pull the plug, so to speak? There's different, opinions as far as I know on that issue, but I think it's also a case-by-case type of analysis. So this allows, having something in advance of being in that situation allows some guidance for the family. And so, again, it's something to think about. There's also things related to organ donation. And again, there's different opinions regarding that, whether it's permissible to donate the organ or not. Again, I'm not here to provide an opinion on that. That's something that the ulama can provide instruction on. And mashallah, we have Dr. Siddiqui and Sheikh Mustafa to do that for us today as well, if it comes up. And then, of course, there's burial instructions. This is actually probably not a big issue for Muslims who have Muslim families, but some people, they want to make sure they're buried. Maybe they purchased a plot already. They want a certain person in the community to lead the janazah prayer, etc. So there's things that you can put in there, that the family can use as guidance for when a person dies. In particular, for people who converted to Islam, this becomes really, really important, because if they have non-Muslim family members, sometimes they don't know that the person is converted to Islam, or they don't want to accept that they've converted to Islam, and so they end up giving them a burial, or that is not Islamic, right? That is in accordance with the family's religious background, and sometimes that means being cremated, or they put them in a crypt, or buried above ground in one of those mausoleums or something like that. So there's a lot of, issues related to that. So this becomes really important. In fact, I had a friend of mine who had a family member, their ex-spouse who had converted to Islam passed away, and the mother of that person wanted to have her cremated, and because there was no burial instructions, there was no documentation that could be presented. They ended up, as far as I know, I think at this point they ended up having to cremate her. So, these are pretty heartbreaking situations that, we want to avoid as much as possible. So it just, again, this is all part of the estate planning process where you kind of have to think about these things and address them before a person dies, so that, we're not in these situations where, other people, end up making these decisions for us. Can we move to the next slide? I think that was the end of the slides. Yeah, that was it. You can go back. So that's it. That's it in terms of, obviously this is a very kind of a estate planning 101 type of presentation. So I'm sure there's people have more questions that they have. So I'll leave it back to Saima.
Jazakallah khairan, Masood, for that very informative introduction into estate planning. And I think the main takeaway from that is that it is extremely important and critical and really our obligation to plan our estate while we are alive and while we are mentally capable of doing so. It is our obligation, especially if we intend to comply with our Islamic requirements. And so you have pointed us in the direction of what we can do to document our wishes in writing, and also how to avoid probate, which I think is very important too, if you want to dispose of your assets and estate in an efficient, timely manner, and in doing so help your family or surviving relatives. So I think that was very helpful. Thank you for that. And now we can turn to a discussion of question and answers. We can have a question and answer session, and I think we can bring back all the panelists. Thank you so much. So one of the most common questions that we receive with respect to Islamic inheritance in particular is, why do daughters typically receive 1/2 the share of inheritance as sons? And if parents want to provide for each of their children's sons and daughters equally, is it Islamically permissible for them to do so, for example, through lifetime gifts? And I think we should address that question to our scholars on the panel, Dr. Siddiqui and Sheikh Mustafa. If you could expound on that, that would be very helpful.
Assalamu alaikum. As far as giving in lifetime, yes, in the lifetime you can give as much as you want. You can give equal portion to sons and daughters. It is permissible. It will be called hiba. It will not be called heirs. That is not inheritance. But you make them owner of that. That is, whatever you give is already transferred to their name in their life, in your life. If you do that, then it's permissible. Of course, one should try to be as fair as possible among all the children. Once after the death, it has to be according to the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is what the law of inheritance means, that after the death, what Allah decided, لِلذَّكَرُ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ, that is for the male, the double the share of the female. Why? Of course, as far as Sheikh Mustafa mentioned, that in many other laws, women had no right at all. Islam recognized the rights of the women, but the rights are with the responsibilities. It is not just everybody has the right and there is no responsibility. The rights and the responsibilities are together. And generally in Islam, men have more responsibilities, financial responsibilities toward their families. Husbands have responsibilities toward their wives. Fathers have responsibility toward their daughters. Even if father is not there and you have widow, sister, brother has a responsibility toward her sister. So there are many responsibilities, financial responsibilities that males have toward their family, which are not the responsibilities of the females. So that's why it's recognized in that system. It's the overall system of justice that Islam has made. If you look at it, just isolated and look at it, you say, look, why daughter is getting half than the share of the son. But again, whose responsibilities are more, whose obligations are more, and Sharia has recognized that way. Sheikh Mustafa, want to add something?
Dr. Siddiqui, if you could just center your camera because you're going off the camera slightly. Exactly.
Is that all right now? No. No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Exactly. Sheikh Mustafa, if you would like to add to that, Islamically speaking, why daughters receive typically one half the share, I believe Dr. Siddiqui explained that the rights follow the responsibilities, and typically men have more responsibilities financially, and that is why that is the case. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, there's nothing to add, but I'll just reiterate kind of what he's saying. And I think a lot of people don't understand this. We have to look at Sharia as a whole. So when we zoom out and we look at, if we're going to apply it as a whole, this is what happens. That when you get married, let's say you have a son and a daughter, right? Son and daughter are 12 years old. And you say, well, okay, the parents passed away, and why does the son get double the share? Well, what's going to happen in Islam is in a few years when they grow up and they get married, well, when the guy gets married, he's responsible for paying for the entire family. Maybe he has 5 children. Maybe he has 10 children. He's financially responsible for paying for the wife, paying for the children, paying for everything. And when the woman gets married, she's not going to have any responsibilities for paying for anything. And let's say she gets a job. She's going to work full-time or she's going to work part-time. All of that money belongs to her. She keeps it in her account and she doesn't have to pay anything. And in fact, according to many opinions, if her husband cannot support her, she's allowed to give zakat to him because it's his responsibility, you know. So from when you look at it from that perspective, from the financial responsibility perspective, Islam is giving the inheritance of what people are going to be needing. And if a woman's going to be needing less because she doesn't have the same financial obligations, then it's really not a problem. And I know many people have had an issue with this. It took me a long time too, you know, growing up, took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around this until I finally realized we have to zoom out and look at the whole system. If people are not going to implement the whole system and everyone's going to be paying 50-50, like many people today, they do that. You know, my non-Muslim friends, when their husband and wife, they go out to a restaurant, they pay 50-50, they split the bill. And when I told them, you know, in Islam, we don't do anything like this. Something like this would never happen. It's the guy's responsibility. They pay 50-50 rent when they're living together, you know, whether they're cohabiting or they're married. And then when they heard this, a Catholic couple, and when they heard this, they said, mashallah, the woman was so happy. She says, this is great. I wish my husband becomes Muslim so I can save a lot of money, you know. So when we look at it from the perspective of the responsibilities and rights, it makes complete sense. If we remove that from the equation, of course it doesn't make sense. It's going to seem to be very unfair. So I just urge Muslims to understand the Sharia as a whole. And if you remove the part and you think everything is 50-50 and men and women are going to both be paying rent 50%, then of course this is not going to be making sense to you. So just keep that in mind always. Also, when it comes to gifts, Dr. Siddiqui mentioned a really important point, and I just want to emphasize this a little bit more, is that some people, when they hear that you can gift to your daughters before they pass away, this idea of gifting means complete transfer of ownership. So what happens is that if you gift this money to your daughter and then you say, you know, but then she starts, you know, disobeying me, she's not cleaning her room or she's not doing whatever I want, you cannot take it back. you cannot somehow maintain control over that property and say, well, I've gifted it to you for now, but I can somehow take it back. Once a gift is transferred, it cannot be taken back. So people want to have their cake and eat it too, as they say, meaning they want to have their cake and they want to eat it and then keep their cake. And that's what it actually means. So you can't do that. You either are going to maintain your own property because you don't want to give it away before you die, or you're going to gift it over to your children, and you have to be fair when you're gifting. And there's a hadith about this. Very serious. One man by the name of, one man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, Messenger of Allah, I've given Nu'man a garden from my property. I want you to be a witness that I gifted it to him. The Prophet ﷺ said, did you give all your children the same type of gift? And he said, no. And he said, ask someone else to be witness. I'm not going to be witness. So he realized the Prophet ﷺ was upset. The Messenger of Allah, why? He said, don't you want all your children to respect you equally? He said, yeah, of course I want that. And he says, then don't do stuff like this. If you want your children to respect you equally, then you should treat them equally as well. So we should be very careful when it comes to even gifting, when it comes to children.
Jazakallah. Our next question is regarding guardianship and custody of minors. It would be very helpful for the scholars and also for Masood to touch upon how Islam addresses the issue of guardianship and custody of surviving minors of a decedent.
I can mention the legal aspect just very quickly. Obviously, the parents are always the legal guardians unless there's a court order otherwise because of some, care issue where they're neglecting the children or something like that, or the children are taken out of the home. But by default, the mother and the father are the guardians legally. And then after if both parents happen to pass away, then another family member can actually become a legal guardian through a court order, and then actually adopt them, or become, not just necessarily adopt them, but actually become their legal guardian. And then they have full authority to make decisions for them and whatnot. Islamically, of course, I'll let Dr. Muzammil Mustafa answer that in terms of the Sharia aspect of adoption and whatnot.
In the case of divorce, there are minor children. There are different views, actually. There is no one uniform view. According to many authorities, many jurists, mother has right for the minor children because this is in the best interest of the children, that they stay with their mother. Of course, if she is married and she is not able to, then the father will be doing that, or from the family of the father's side. But generally, the for the minors, the preference is for the mother. Of course, the father has to pay the expenses for their living, for their medical expenses, for their education in the early age. Once they grow up and they become different ages have been suggested by different jurists. Once they grow up, then it becomes the custody goes to the father in that case. Unless the grown-up children want to be closer to their mother, that's all right, because they will be given a choice which way they want to go with the mother or with the father. But the father will remain as long as they are, they need the expenses and from their father, the father has to provide for that. That's the general rule, of course. Mostly it goes to the court, and the court has to decide that. The Muslim judge will decide that. So there is nothing called automatic transfer of guardianship or custody.
Sheikh Mustafa, would you like to add, in the event of the death of the parent, one parent or both parents, how Islam addresses guardianship of minors?
Yeah, so like Dr. Muzammil said, similar to divorce, there are some different opinions when it comes to guardianship, whether it's through divorce or whether it's through death. it's going to be going generally to the closest relatives. So it's going to be if their grandmother or grandfather is still alive, then it's going to be going to them. It's going to be going to the nearest, closest family member in general. But there's what really ends up happening, and Maliki school is very good on this, is that like Dr. Muzammil said, it's very similar to California law, is that it's going to go to a court and a Muslim judge is going to make the decision of what's in the best interest of the child. Of course, the difference between a California court and an Islamic court, hypothetically, if there was an Islamic court, is that the best interest of the child is going to take Islam into consideration. Who is going to be able to not only financially take care of the child, but when we talk about, give them a good upbringing, give them a good education, meaning give them good tarbiyah, give them good Islamic values. So if you have, for example, historically, let's say 1,000 years ago, in the golden age of Islam, someone goes to a Muslim court and they find that, one of the people who is in line for guardianship, they don't pray, they don't fast, they're drinking alcohol or something, automatically going to be excluded. Whether or not they're an alcoholic, if they're not someone who's a practicing Muslim, they don't have Islamic values, they're going to be skipped when it comes to becoming a guardian for this child, because they're not in the best Islamic interests of the child. So all of that is going to play a role. And I think what we need, in America and in places where Muslims are a minority, is we need, and people don't like to use this term, but I mean, we need Sharia courts. Or equivalent of a Sharia court. And I don't think it's controversial to even bring that up, because the Jews have this. They have what's called the Beit Din of America, and they call it a rabbinic court. And the rabbinic court has been functioning for 40, 50 years in this country. So what that's going to do is it's going to bring a concept of qualified people who have training in Islamic law and fiqh, as well as some training in like qada, or like judgment, or being in law and applying law in qanun. And those people who can combine these two fields will be making the decision of what's in the best Islamic interest of the child. It's going to be probably similar, take a lot of things that California judges will be taking into consideration, but it's going to add an Islamic element to it as well. And that will obviously, change some of the decisions. And Muslims should, eventually be going to those courts for everything, for divorce issues and separation, and even when it comes to custody of the children as well. So inshallah, hopefully we get there someday.
Inshallah. Just a quick follow-up with respect to estate planning. Then, is it Islamically permissible and recommended for parents to specify who their preference is for acting as the guardian of the minor in the event of their death?
Yeah, you can include that in the documents. There's documentation for guardianship in a typical estate plan. And, the parents can figure out which family member they, would do that. It's obviously Islamically, you might want to, see which family member would be most appropriate for that. And then they can include that in there.
Thank you. Our next question is it comes from a community member who asks, my father passed away, and according to my mother, he left all of his property to her. My mother is planning to remarry now. What are my rights as the only son to my father's estate under Islamic law?
I'll let the scholars answer that.
When the property is under her name, does it mean that it is her property? As he say expressly in his life that I give you everything that I have. If he has a document of that, if he transferred the property to her, therefore then she is the owner of it. But if he is just property was in both the names and she assumed that all the property is her, it is not. She will have only her right, her share, which is according to that, it will be 12.5%. It will be 1/8 because the child is there, because he has the son. And if there's only son after that, there's no other child, then the rest is all belong to the son. And he has the right to ask that. So especially now, if she's getting married, what will happen? That means if she dies, that whole thing will go back to her husband, and that's very unfair. That the father of the child of the son, whatever he had goes to a total stranger, and the son does not get anything. That's why it's so important to have that the blood relatives have preference over matrimonial relationship on that in the law of Sharia. So the son's right cannot be taken away. The son has a right in the property of his father, and then mother also do the same thing. When she dies, it will be all her sons. This son, and then if she has another son after that from the second marriage, of course they will have the right. So they will have the right. The husband will have the right also, but the husband's right will be, in case of children, will be only 1/4. So this is the whole structure of the law. And so one has to see that how the father left the money, left the property. Whether he left the property in the sense that he gave her the whole thing in his life, transferred everything, or not. Of course, he should not have done that. He should have also given something for his son. But if he has done that, then it will be a different situation.
Does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, this is a common question, actually. I get a lot of these issues come up, and sometimes there's an assumption that the money was transferred over, but it wasn't clear cut. And when it comes to gifting of property, there's a requirement in Islam. When you have to gift something, not only do you have to have the intention, but you need to actually have the transfer. So if you have an item, for example, and you want to give this, and you say, you know what, I want to give this to you as a gift, but then you don't actually hand it over yet, the transfer of the gift is not taking place in Sharia. Just making the intention or saying, you know, I'm going to do this, or I want to do this, or something like that doesn't even count as a valid transfer from a Sharia perspective. So sometimes people assume that money has been transferred, but it's not. So it's very important to look into that, first of all. And I just want to reiterate what Dr. Muzammil said. If that's what he's doing, even if it was valid, it's not correct, because people should not be gifting money in their lifetime so that they could exclude other people from inheritance. This is very wrong, because what's the point then of Allah specifying all these shares, and then you try and get around those shares and say, well, I don't want my son, or I don't want my brother, or I don't want so-and-so to get my property, gift it all to someone who I want to have it before I die. This is wrong. If that's the intention, it's really bad. And if it's not the intention, and it's the form, and it even looks like that, then you're still violating, you're going against the spirit of the Sharia, even if you didn't intend to do that. So we should just be very careful when it comes to those types of gifts.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that. I mean, you get people all the time that say, yeah, you know, my child, they you know, they do X, Y, and Z, or this person is not, you know, whatever, you know, is not a very good relation to me, or whatever. So they end up kind of, you know, making their own distribution. And sometimes they're good Muslims in every other regard, but for some reason, this particular issue, people kind of feel they can, you know, change whatever the Islamic rules are, and just kind of do it however they want. So I think it's important for people to recognize and understand that there's very specific shares that people are entitled to based on blood. And so, yeah, thank you for Sheikh Mustafa and Dr. Muzammil mentioned that.
As a follow-up, California is a community property state, and maybe Masood can just briefly explain what that means and how that interacts with preparing your estate plan in an Islamic manner, or does it? Does it affect your estate plan or not?
Yeah, it does, definitely. So in community property, there's a handful of states in the United States that are considered community property states. And what that means is that when there's a marriage, the husband and the wife regardless of who is earning the money, during the course of the marriage, their property is, the earnings are considered owned 50-50 between the two of them. And so in the event of a divorce, if say, the wife, let's say the wife was not working and the husband was working, and there's a divorce, the wife would actually get 50% of all of the assets. And that would be derivative as well. So anything that was earned during the course of the marriage and then that money was used to buy something or invest in something, or they created a bit, maybe the husband owned a business and he invested, a certain amount of money during the marriage, and the business appreciated and is now worth a significant amount of money, the wife would get 50% of everything. So in estate planning, so we'll use the example of, say, a house. So typically people will buy a house, and typically for most families, the house will be in the name of the wife and the husband. And even if it was not in the name of the wife, for example, and this is very common actually, people buy a house, during the marriage, and they'll just say, they'll just have the husband's name or maybe just the wife's name. If it's a community property state, that will still be considered 50-50, even though on title it only has one person's name on it, unless they have written up either a prenuptial agreement before they were married that specifies that each spouse's earnings will be separate, or they sign something called a marital agreement, which is similar to a prenuptial, except it's signed after they're married, which also spells out the same thing, is that the assets are going to be divided 50-50. I'm sorry, divided separate based on whatever they earned. So if the wife doesn't earn anything, then everything will belong to the husband, or vice versa. And that would have to be done in a community property state to not count the property as community property. Okay, so that definitely plays a role in estate planning, because if in a community property state there is some asset, and let's say the husband dies, that asset is now going to be considered 50-50 between the two spouses. And so if you were to apply an Islamic distribution to it, then the wife would already own 50% under California law, and then if you apply the Islamic distribution to it, she would own an eighth of that, for example. So now, as far as I know, there's a difference of opinion in terms of whether the California law is applicable in a Sharia context or not. Some ulama I've talked to say that yes, we recognize that if the state is a community property state, then that will be considered their half share. So I'm not sure what Dr. Muzammil and Sheikh Mustafa maybe can comment on that as well. But that's my understanding, is that if it's community property, if it's a community property state, then the spouses are treated as if they own it 50-50 for the purposes of distribution later.
In the community property situation, it is, yes, assumed that half belong to the wife, half belong to the husband. If this is what they want, then they should do it. I mean, they should clearly say that, husband say that half of my house is for my wife, and make it that way. Otherwise, he should make a will and prepare that and say the whole property belong to me, and she will get only 1/4 or 1/8. And this should be written in the will, and she should sign that too. She should understand that this is her right. Otherwise, if you leave it without preparing a will, then the law of the land will prevail, and it will happen. And sometimes people do that. If you decide that no, half of the house is for the wife, then of course after the death of the husband, half of the house is her, and the rest of the house, she will get 1/8 from that, and the rest of the children will get that from that. She will have her right in the other half too. That much. What is the, because that is husband's property. the husband's property, wife will have a right. And in case wife dies before the husband, then husband will have his share in her property. So these things, that's why it is so important that the will should be prepared, and these things are specified.
Yeah, it just to build off of what Dr. Muzammil was saying, that a community property, it's in 9 states and many European countries, causes a lot of conflict, and there's a lot of confusion when it comes to both divorce as well as death. And the default in Islam is that property ownership is separate, and that's the default in Islam. And I've written a fatwa on this. It's on askthescholars.com, and basically what happens if you move to a different state where there's common law property, then all of a sudden the rules are going to change. And if you move back to a community property state, the rules are going to change in terms of ownership. This is not something recognized by Sharia. So I know that some scholars have said you just go with whatever the law of the land is, and then if you change states, then the law of the land has changed. If you change states again, the law of the land changes again. I think that's very harmful for society. And what ends up happening is that this causes a lot of friction between husband and wife when there's a divorce, or when there's death. Obviously, death, there's not much friction because one person is dead, but especially when it comes to divorce. And people want to get whatever's in their best interests. So if a husband has earned a lot of money and the wife has earned a little bit, then she says, well, I want my 50% because that's a law of the land. But I've seen many cases where it's flipped, where the woman has been working and she's been making a lot of money, and then there's a divorce case, and then the man says, I want my 50%. And now all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute, I don't like this 50-50 anymore. So I think it's very important for us to be just and to be equitable, and to focus on the justice aspect. So keeping people's property separate has always been what Islam has recommended. Property should be viewed as separate, and either prenuptial or postnuptial or interspousal transfer agreements, or all of those things should be done in a way that you specify what is separate property. And there are some men who don't leave any property in their wife's name throughout the entire marriage, and then they divorce them and they say, well, it doesn't matter if you were homeschooling all 10 children and putting so much effort into it, all this money that I made is mine. That's also very wrong. So what should be done is there should be a way where she's getting some type of savings, some type of compensation, building up some savings in the event of something that happens. And that's the way it should be. And likewise, if she's working full time and she's keeping all of her money, and then they get divorced, on what basis is the man going to say, well, I was a little lazy and I was going on vacations and I was, at the hookah bar with my friends, but mashallah, you worked really hard. I'm going to take 50% of that. You can't imagine how many cases I'm dealing with when it comes to that, especially if the woman owns a home and she's worked her whole life. And I've seen guys, they didn't work for the last 10 years and they're sitting on unemployment, and their wife is making, $200,000 a year. She buys a property, or she's gifted a property by her family, and then now he wants to claim transmutation of that property into community property. And she said, this is not fair. My family gifted me $1 million home. He got to live in it for free. He didn't pay any rent. And Islamically, he's a man. He's supposed to be taking care of me. I'm actually taking care of him. And now he wants 50% of my property. This is very wrong. So my view, and I'm pretty stern on this view, and I've reflected on it for a long time, I think the community property laws ideally should be bypassed legally, and there should be equitable, fair distribution of wealth in the event of divorce or death. And that's the best way to go about it. Now, if that doesn't happen, then we have to go with whatever actual ownership of property is.
Yeah, I think it's very important that they both should prepare proper document for that. If she doesn't want husband to be a part of it, then they have to prepare a clear document on that. The property is totally her, or the same thing with the husband. But there is something also happened that husband was a student. He's studying, and then after that he got his doctorate and he got a good position and making a lot of money, and wife was just a housekeeper. I mean, she was taking care of him and children, all of this thing. And then he divorces her. and said that you have nothing except your mahar, and that was 100 rupees in Pakistan. And so that's it. After about 20 years, 30 years of marriage, he gives her just her mahar and doesn't give her anything because all the property belongs to me. That's also not fair. So we have to see a kind of equitable system where we can give it right to the wife and give right to the husband in the right way. Brother Masood, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh yeah, no. I was just going to mention that if there is an issue with the difference of opinion about the community property or not, probably the way to avoid that is to make sure you get a a prenuptial or a marital agreement documented and signed properly. So that way everything is in order. Both parties are clear what they are getting and what they're not getting, and it actually it keeps the expectations in check, and it also avoids a lot of problems in the event of divorce. So that would be something very important to do. So, and also just Islamically, you're probably avoiding a lot of other doubtful issues as well.
Mr. Saima, I have another commitment, so I will be leaving. If you are, please continue. So I want to excuse myself.
Jazakallah. Thank you so much for your time.
And nice. May Allah bless you.
This was an extremely informative panel. We wanted to ask one more question, so if the panelists who are remaining can stay online, we can have one more question. And I think there are so many interesting areas that we could talk about, but I think the one area that Masood mentioned during his talk is extremely important one, and one that comes up a lot in families, and that is how to address the issue of life support and life-saving measures, and whether...
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Jazakallah. What is Islamically permissible with respect to the issue of life support and how to address it? There are certain people who would like to, do everything permissible and possible to preserve their life in the event that they are in that situation. And then there are others who say, do not resuscitate. I want a DNR. I don't want to prolong the inevitable. Islamically, what is the position on that, and how do we address that in our estate plan?
Sure, I'll answer these.
Start with Sheikh Mustafa. Thank you.
Sure. So when it comes to withholding life support and DNR and all of those things, this comes back to an old issue which Muslim scholars discussed, and that is that if somebody is sick or somebody's ill and they're dying, are they required to take medicine? And if they refuse to take medicine, are they going to be sinful for not taking it? And that's when it comes back down to the probability or the likelihood of this medicine working and causing them to survive. And also, is this kind of like a 50-50? Is it like a 30% or whatever it is? So there's many different fatwas that scholars have given classically on this issue. And there's some difference of opinion on issues like this. So pretty much, I think the dominant view is that when there's no guarantee that this is going to work, you're allowed to refuse life support. You're allowed to refuse, certain type of things when there's no guarantee that they're going to be able to save your life and you don't know what's going to happen. So just keeping you alive in a vegetative state or something like that is not really viewed as curing you or bringing you to a point where it's restoring you back to health. So denying life support, having a DNR is permissible. It's in the category of permissibility. So if people choose to have that, it's generally allowed according to many scholars. And if people don't want to have that and they want to maintain the possibility of keeping them alive and perhaps they're going to snap out of a coma or something like that, that is also permissible. So both of these fall into the category of permissibility. So it's in the mubah category, which means they can opt for this or they can opt for that. And whether or not there's like a preference on this side or a preference on that side, a lot of difference of opinion. So this is generally what I tell people is that if that's what you're comfortable with, if that's what you choose to do, you have the option to do that.
And
yeah, in terms of the
way to address that in your estate plan.
Yeah, so in the estate plan you would have an advanced healthcare directive that would address exactly what Sheikh Mustafa mentioned. Either whatever I typically when I'm, dealing with people, I don't tell them what to do. That's a very, personal decision, and usually they'll consult with family members and, scholars and whatnot. And as Sheikh Mustafa said, there's a difference of opinion, so they can specify how they want to be dealt with in that situation. Whether they want to receive every possible type of care available to them medically, to keep them alive and to try to resuscitate them, or they can choose otherwise. That if there's no scientifically reasonable way that they can medically, technologically available way for them to be resuscitated, then just let them go. And then you can also allow in the document to have a family member kind of make that decision for you based on whatever the circumstances are at that time. Whether maybe they're talking to the doctors and whatnot, and sometimes it's a judgment call. It's a kind of a 50-50 situation, and so you can kind of let somebody you trust to help make that decision when the time comes, and you can mention who that person is in the advanced healthcare directive.
Thank you. And I think this is, again, a point where we can remind people how very important it is to document your wishes in this regard ahead of time while you are alive and while you are mentally capable of doing so, because there are so many situations that arise when a person is not conscious and not capable of making their wishes known. And then there are conflicts amongst the surviving, the living members, relatives, over what to do in those situations. And so it is very extremely important that you document your wishes now while you can, so that conflict does not arise in the future. So again, I would like to thank all of our speakers today. This was extremely informative and enlightening, and inshallah, I hope that whoever watched was able to take something away from it that will help them in their own planning for their estates and inheritance issues, inshallah. So with that, I will now turn it over for our closing with Nader.
Jazakallah khairan, everybody. That was an amazing program. Thank you so much to our amazing panelist speakers. Thank you for the information, the knowledge, the hikmah. We really do appreciate it. So at this point, as we're closing, I do want to mention a quick plug-in that Eid United has donated $5,000 to the Insan Foundation for those in need during this holiday season. This is made in part due to your donations, so please do make sure to continue your generous donations. For donating, please visit our website at eidunited.org. That's eidunited.org. At this point, just a few shout outs that thank you so much to our volunteers, our board, our staff, our moderator, Sister Saima, our amazing speakers, Dr. Muzammil, Sheikh Mustafa, Brother Masood, and to our amazing design studio that we could not make this happen without you, Samson Production, who really made this happen over here. For more information, please make sure to keep updated at our website for more information about our next program. With that, Jazakallah khairan and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.